going to have a look at taxonomy. So that's just kind of like the classification of coral. All right, we're going to look at physiology, feeding strategies of corals, and threats to coral reefs. Okay, and then we are going to have a look at Sodwana's reefs and what makes Sodwana's reef so special, so unique. And then we'll actually get into identification of some common coral species that we have here. So first off, what are coral reefs? So coral reefs are dynamic underwater ecosystems. Okay, so a healthy coral reef is probably one of the most diverse, complex, and economically valuable ecosystems. Now, dynamic means that there's constant change and activity. So often we watch those National Geographic videos of coral reefs, and it's all like portrayed really tranquil and calm and peaceful. It's really not like that. There's a lot of stuff going on a reef, okay? And if you're a diver, you've probably kind of noticed that a little bit already. You probably hear the popping and the clicking underwater. That's all the little shrimps and everything else going on and doing their thing. But you also see all the fish and everything darting around as well. So it's a really, really vibrant ecosystem. Now, coral reefs are a biogenic structure formed by the corals that deposit calcium carbonate to form a living substrate. Now, biogenic simply means that it is made by a living organism, okay? It's made by those living corals. So yes, corals are not rocks, they are not plants, they are animals, okay? They're actually colonies, sorry, colonies of tiny living organisms called polyps. Now, a coral reef is a physical structure built by the organisms that comprise it. So many species of organisms on the reef produce calcium carbonate that is laid down by the organism. This leads to the growth of the reef. When the organism dies, the calcium carbonate remains and new organisms will use this as a place to settle. Hence, the reef structure continues to grow on the skeletons of old organisms. So corals are marine invertebrates from the phylum Cnidaria and the class Anthozoa, and they are made up of colonies of identical polyps. So within Anthozoa, you've got a couple subclasses, but the ones that we are going to kind of be focusing on is Octocoralia, which is your soft corals, and your Hexacoralia, which are your hard, stony corals and sea anemones. Now you'll notice that the phylum Cnidaria contains some other animals, including jellyfish, what we call black corals, and we'll get into some black corals later on, and also fire corals. So the word Cnidaria means stinger because all the members of this phylum have stinging cells or nematocysts. Now, having a look at our soft corals, okay, these guys in the Octocoralia, they have 8 tentacles, okay, so it's a ring of 8 tentacles that surrounds the mouth, and their tentacles have kind of these feather-like structures called pinnules on their tentacles, okay, and they use those to capture plankton. They also don't have hard, rigid skeletons, but they might have little spines or spicules that is embedded in the tissue to help provide some structure to the colony. Your Scleractinian or your hard, stony corals, okay, these guys have tentacles that are smooth and they are in multiples of 6. Okay, so your soft corals will always only have 8 tentacles around the mouth, okay? Your hard, stony corals may have 6, 12, etc., etc. Okay, and like I said, they are nice, smooth tentacles. Now, these hard, stony corals secrete a calcium carbonate skeleton that forms a little cup or a corallite in which the polyps live. So the phylum Cnidaria is quite a large phylum of animals, and it covers a large variety of organisms. The main characteristics of these animals in the group Cnidaria is that they have a simple body with a centralized body cavity that contains the digestive system and a single opening used as the mouth and the gut. And this is surrounded by tentacles that are covered in nematocysts, or those stinging cells. All cnidarians have two structural forms. So they are either a sessile form, which it means they are attached to the substrate. This is called the polyp, okay? Or they are a free-swimming form called the medusa, okay? And polyps can either be solitary, like anemones, okay, or they can form colonies, like most hard corals. So all cnidaria will go through both stages, so both the sessile and the free-swimming form during its life stage, or lifetime, sorry, but the duration of each stage varies. And some species actually spend the vast majority of their life as the medusa or the free-swimming form. So think of things like your jellyfish. They spend most of their time as that free-swimming thing, okay? Where others will actually spend most of their time as the sessile or the polyp form. So things like your corals and anemones. Okay, so getting into our physiology. Okay, so the unit of a coral is the polyp. Okay, this is an individual animal that grows and divides to form larger corals. So the corals that you see on a reef, it's very rarely a single individual animal, but it's actually colonies of many polyps. And they all originate from the same first polyp, and also they are genetically identical, okay? The polyp secretes calcium carbonate to form the exoskeleton, which produces a little cup, or what we call a corallite, in which the polyp sits. So
apologies, Christy. Sorry, if you can just pause there. Sorry, somebody hijacked our presentation. Can you just go back, bring up your presentation screen again?
Of course. Resume my presentation. Is that working again?
There we go. Sorry, thank you very much.
That's all right.
Okay, guys, if you see something that says presentation, don't click on it.
That's all right. Okay.
Just make it full screen there.
Yeah.
There we go. Lovely.
Okay. So the corallite is the little cup, okay, that we were talking about there. And this is what the polyp can retract into to avoid stress or predators. Okay, so having a look on this diagram, the walls surrounding the cup are called the theca, okay, and the floor is called the basal plate. So periodically, a healthy polyp will lift off its base and secrete a new basal plate above the old one. And thus, a living colony of polyps deposits calcium carbonate, adding layers and elevating the coral. Okay, so the coral basically just builds layers and layers and layers, and that's how the reef gets bigger. So you can think of a coral polyp as an upside-down jellyfish that lives inside a little cup or skeleton that it secretes itself. So once a coral dies, it becomes a substrate for a new polyp to settle and grow and replicate. So most hard corals have very small polyps, averaging only 1 to 3 millimeters in diameter, but entire colonies can grow very large and weigh several tons. As they grow, these reefs provide structural habitats for hundreds to thousands of different vertebrate and invertebrate species. So, oopsie, sorry, there you go. So having a look at this, this is a diagram of a single polyp in a corallite. Okay, so it's a thing they're called mesentery tissue. These are basically the digestive filaments, okay, and they help to actually build the skeleton of the coral. The cenosarc is the thin layer of tissue that sits over the skeleton and links the polyps in a colony together. So here you can see the colony of polyps. Okay, so you can see that the cenosarc links each polyp to its neighbor, all right? And this is a really important thing for corals because it allows the colony to share resources like nutrients. This is also why if something, you know, if you might have seen, like while you're diving, you might see a fish kind of nipping on one side of the coral and you see the whole coral you know, change color, or you see all the polyps go in, okay? That's because the coral colony is sharing that information. Okay, so it's sharing the information that there is potential danger, and that all the polyps need to retract into the corallite to avoid that danger. So you can think of a colony of polyps as an apartment building. Each polyp is an individual apartment, and together they make up the whole building. Ooh. Okay. So corals feed via autotrophy and heterotrophy. An autotroph is an organism that can basically make its own food, okay? So it produces complex organic compounds from simple substances in the environment. Okay, so your autotrophs are your primary producers in the food chain. So by converting inorganic molecules into organic ones using energy from the sunlight, the photosynthetic algae that lives within the coral polyps provides the coral with nutrients. Essentially, it feeds the coral, okay? The zooxanthellae that lives within the coral tissues is found in very high densities, okay? And they absorb the carbon dioxide from the water to use during photosynthesis. And so they fix that, they fix it as a usable carbon in the form of carbohydrates and that kind of thing. And this is what is used in cellular respiration, reproduction, and as energy to the host coral polyp. So corals actually receive up to 90% of all their required energy or nutrition from that photosynthetic zooxanthellae that lives inside their tissues. So it's a really important partnership that they have with that algae. Now, a heterotroph is an organism that cannot produce its own food. So it must rely on obtaining its nutrition from other sources of plant or animal matter. So heterotrophs are essentially your primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers in the food chain. Now, they have these nematocysts, which are those stinging cells that are on the tentacles, okay? Now, they are harpoon-like, okay? And like we said earlier, they are found in all cnidarians. So the nematocyst is it's housed in what we call a cnidocyte, okay? And this is basically like a little pocket with a trapdoor. So the cnidocell is the trigger mechanism. And so when the prey brushes against the cnidocell, the trapdoor opens and the nematocyst is released from the capsule. A dormant nematocyst discharges in response to nearby prey touching the cnidocell. The operculum flaps open and its stinging apparatus fires the barb into the prey, leaving a hollow filament through which poisons are injected to immobilize the prey. And then the tentacles kind of maneuver the prey to the mouth. Now you'll see in the related materials section on the classroom, I've posted a really cool video of, I think it was anemone tentacles that showing the discharge of the nematocyst, but it works the same for corals as well, and it's a really nice visual. So definitely do check that out. So like I said earlier, that coral-algae symbiosis or relationship is really, really important. Okay, so the corals receive a couple things. Now it is, like I said earlier, it is a mutualistic symbiotic relationship, okay? So both the coral and the algae benefit from this partnership. So most importantly, this partnership provides the coral with the nutrients and energy that is required for their survival, okay? The algae gets a couple things, okay? So it gets, you know, all the the resources needed to actually photosynthesize, and it also is protected within the coral cells. A cool thing though is that studies have actually shown that certain species or strains of the zooxanthellae algae actually increase a coral's resilience to stressful conditions like warm water or that kind of thing. And so the species of zooxanthellae that a coral has is actually able to increase their survival chances in times of stress, which is pretty cool. So speaking about stress, bleaching is a pretty hot topic, excuse the pun. You guys have probably heard about coral bleaching happening in Australia, on Australian reefs and that kind of thing. It happens all over the world. And yeah, it tends to be happening a bit more regularly now, unfortunately. So I thought I'd just kind of give you guys an overview of what coral bleaching is. So first off, corals thrive best in very specific conditions. Okay, so they need to have temperatures that are between, on average, 20 to 29 degrees Celsius. Okay, they need lots of light, particularly for that photosynthetic zooxanthellae that lives within their tissues. Okay, they also need low sedimentation, appropriate salinity, and continual refreshment by ocean currents and wave action. Okay. Now, under stressful conditions, the zooxanthellae essentially becomes toxic to the coral, and so the coral expels the zooxanthellae. The corals begin to lose its color until it is completely white. At this point, the coral is bleached, okay, and it has lost its main source of nutrients and energy. So you remember I said earlier that a coral receives up to 90% of its energy from the zooxanthellae. Okay, so in like situations where a coral is bleaching, they lose that main source of energy. Now, bleached corals have a high risk of mortality because it is more susceptible to starvation, disease, and further stress from other impacts like pollution. If the stressful conditions improve, corals can recover by taking up zooxanthellae from the water again, okay? But if conditions do not improve quick enough, the corals will eventually die and become overgrown by kind of fleshy macroalgae. So not the same algae that lives inside the coral. These are kind of what we'd call your bad algae, I guess. Now, the loss of coral on reefs due to bleaching has some major environmental consequences, and it is a huge concern for us. For example, the loss of coral cover can lead to disrupted ecosystems, reduced environmental quality, decline in fish populations, reduced biodiversity, coastal erosion, and loss in tourism revenue. So it's definitely something that we should care about. Speaking of caring about coral, they are incredibly important, okay? So they have a number of, I guess, vital benefits, okay? So first off, coral reefs cover less than 0.1% of the ocean floor, okay? But they support 25% of all marine species. So this is in the form of habitats and feeding grounds and that kind of thing. They also help to recycle nutrients in the food chain that would otherwise be lost and wasted in the ecosystems. They're also involved in the carbon and nitrogen cycles. Now, those two things are a little bit complicated, so I'm not going to touch on them in the lecture, but do let me know if you are interested in learning more. I can maybe link some articles or that kind of thing that you guys can go through in your own time. So corals build their skeletons from calcium carbonate. To do this, they use the carbon dioxide that is naturally absorbed from the air by the ocean. So reefs are an important carbon sink and a buffer because they actually use up some of that carbon dioxide that would otherwise acidify the oceans. And we'll get to ocean acidification in a little bit. Coral reefs are also incredibly important for humans. So the physical structure of reefs protects coastlines and shores. It absorbs the wave energy and it reduces the impact of big storms that hit the coastline. It's also estimated that worldwide, about 500 million people have some level of dependence upon coral reefs. So this could be in the form of food resources, income from fishing, coastal protection, building materials, and income from tourism as well. So it's estimated that coral reef tourism alone can generate on average 35.8 billion US dollars globally every year. So they're a really important ecosystem, not only environmentally, but economically as well. So keeping that in mind, there are a few things kind of threatening coral reefs, and you guys have probably heard some of this already, but we'll just kind of touch on a few of them. So like I mentioned earlier, large and powerful waves from hurricanes and cyclones can, break apart or flatten large coral colonies and perhaps scatter their fragments, okay? Now, a single storm will seldom kill off an entire colony, but your slower growing corals may be overgrown by kind of fleshy algae and that kind of thing before they can actually recover. Now, there are several animals that live on reefs that have actually adapted to feeding on coral. So, for example, the crown of thorns starfish in that left-hand picture there. If predation levels are too high in a specific area, the reef can be damaged quite a bit by that predation. Tourism is also a valuable industry for the economy of many tropical countries. However, it can be severely damaging to reefs if it's not managed correctly. High-impact tourist areas are often characterized by increased litter, coastal development and degradation, habitat destruction, and pollution. Tourists often fall into the trap of buying souvenirs, so things like seashells and that kind of thing, that actually just increase the demand for taking things out of the sea. Litter can obviously have dire consequences on the reef as well. It can smother and choke the reef, and it can cause huge problems for animals that ingest that trash. Discarded nets can also entrap and kill marine animals. And other forms of pollution may include oil spills, industrial dumping, agricultural runoff, and over-sedimentation. We've already touched on coral bleaching, okay? Like I said, it is a generalized stress response where the corals expel the photosynthetic algae from their tissues, and it is characterized by the corals turning white. So bleaching itself does not kill the coral straight away, although, like I said, it does mean that the coral has lost its main source of food. Okay, so it can cause issues and it makes them more susceptible to other impacts. A majority of people in coastal regions depend on fish as their main source of protein. As the need for fish as food increases, so the exploitation of our reefs will increase if sustainable fishing practices are not put into place. Already, it is estimated that 81% of global fish stocks are exploited or overexploited, and this can lead to severe biodiversity losses on reefs. Now, climate change is also another one that is, talked about quite a lot. Okay, so the biophysical system faces natural fluctuations in environmental conditions through natural cycles like the ENSO or the El Niño Southern Oscillation Cycle, where there'll be naturally occurring periods of extreme weather and natural climate change. However, anthropogenic impacts or human-induced impacts have been linked to the unequivocal and consistent warming of our oceans, as seen in the graph on this slide here. The physical, chemical, and biological changes that will follow this warming may be disastrous. So this graph shows the global annual heat content of the ocean from 1955 to 2005. The lines represent different measurements from different researchers, but you can see that there is a clear trend of global increase in ocean heat. So any temperature increase affects several ecological processes, including foraging, growth, larval durations, and especially on the geographic range of species, resulting in changing species composition and interactions, particularly in your things like your symbiotic relationships. Now, between 1900 and 2016, sea levels rose by about 16 to 21 centimeters. Human-induced global warming is driving the warming of our biosphere, which leads to melting of land-based ice sheets and glaciers. A conservative estimate of the long-term projection is that each Celsius degree of temperature rise triggers a sea level rise of approximately 2.3 meters over a period of 2 millennia. Now, you're probably thinking that's a really long time and, that doesn't really affect me. And you're probably right, it's not going to happen in our lifetime, but it is going to have an impact on the reefs as we know them today, okay? So remember I said earlier, those reefs need particular conditions, and the reefs that we have today, they are growing in areas where they are happy, okay? So we don't want to affect them in any way. Keep in mind, it's also going to impact the tens of millions of people who actually live in those coastal areas. And so, as the seas rise, They lose their homes. Now, ocean acidification is also a huge problem. So the ocean, like I said earlier, naturally absorbs atmospheric carbon dioxide until it reaches equilibrium. So as the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations are increasing because of fossil fuels and that kind of thing, the ocean continues to absorb more and more carbon dioxide because the reaction will continue to maintain the equilibrium. And so this uptake leads to changes in ocean chemistry, resulting in a decrease of seawater pH, so it makes it more acidic, okay? And it also decreases the carbonate ion concentration. Now, the availability of carbonate ions is crucial for many marine organisms that form their skeletons or shells from different crystalline forms of calcium carbonate. So reduced calcification rates leads to reduced coral reef formations. Okay, so that picture at the bottom there, that's a study that was done where the scientists looked at how the effects, like little sea snails and that kind of thing would be affected by ocean acidification. And you can see that that snail has been unable to form the shell correctly because there wasn't enough of that those calcium carbonate ions in the water. So having a look at what makes Sodwana Bay's reefs so special. So the reefs in Sodwana Bay are some of the most southern coral reefs, okay, and they are incredibly diverse. They are built on top of ancient sand dunes along an 80,000-year-old coastline, which means that we have relatively flat reefs with lots of gullies and ledges. Okay, so this picture here is a picture of 2 Mile Reef. You can probably see some of those gullies and that kind of thing along the reef. I don't know if any of you can see your favorite dive sites there. I know I can see mine, so I really miss it, and I'm sure you guys do as well. But yeah. So the reefs in Sodwana are estimated to be around 4,000 years old, okay? And it's a very high energy environment. Again, for those of you who have dived in Sodwana, you know that we experience swell and storms and strong currents and all of that kind of thing. So that high energy environment has actually produced very resilient corals, okay? And we're lucky that we also have a really good mix of hard and soft corals, which is really, really nice. So just going back to that diversity of Sodwana Bay, so just to give you an idea, the Great Barrier Reef in Australia has roughly 1,800 species of fish, okay? Sodwana Bay has around 1,200 fish species, yet it is 1/10 the size of the Great Barrier Reef. So we have an incredible amount of diversity kind of packed into a really small area. So it means that we're really, really lucky to be able to dive here. So we also have the warm Agulhas current that flows down the east coast of South Africa. And this is why we are able to have such beautiful kind of tropical coral reefs growing so far south here where we are. So we really are very, very lucky. Cool, so we're going to get into some identification now. Okay, so just having a look at some methods or I guess characteristics that are important when you want to identify corals. Okay, first off, you want to look at the growth form. Now, the growth form is the basic growth structure of the coral. You know, is it forming a massive kind of bommy kind of shape? Is it more of a branching, maybe like your staghorn corals where there's lots of little branches coming off? Is it folio? So is it quite convoluted and yeah, like kind of wavy looking? Does it form more of a table or a tabulate kind of structure? Does it look like a little plate that's just kind of sitting there? Is the coral digitate? So does it just look like these little fingers kind of poking up out of the substrate? Is it a mushroom coral? Mushroom corals are solitary polyps, okay? They don't form colonies. They are not attached to the substrate. Is it a mushroom coral? Or is it encrusting? So is it lying quite flat on the surface of the reef and it's not really growing up high very much. It's just kind of staying quite low to the ground. You can also look at the structure of the polyps. So are the polyps quite small and squat, or are they quite elongated? What do the tentacles look like? Are they small? Are they feathery? Are they quite elongated? Are they kind of bubble shaped? Yeah, have a look at the tentacles. The colony surface, okay, so you can have a look at the colony surface. Do the coral walls look quite flat, or are the walls quite raised and kind of bumpy looking? What shape are the corallites and how big are they? Also, you can look at the spacing in between coral polyps. So are they quite tightly packed, or are they quite spread out over the surface? Now, you can look at color as well. I tend not to look at color because we've actually learned that the species of, or the strain of zooxanthellae, that algae that lives inside the tissues, is actually what gives the coral its color, okay? So the same species of coral may have two different types of zooxanthellae, and so it'll be two different colors. Okay, so you can use color as a characteristic for identification, but yeah, I tend not to. And yeah, you can also look at location or habitat. Okay, so information like, is it in quite an exposed place, or is it more, sheltered from the currents and the waves and that kind of thing, can help you work out what species it is. You can also look at if it's in quite a silty area. So there are some species that actually, I guess, can tolerate more silty or sandy areas compared to ones that actually prefer to be more higher up on the reef, away from that sand. So you can use that to help you identify as well. Okay, so we're going to get into actually identifying corals now. So these are some of the really common coral species that we find here in Sodwana. So this first one that we're going to look at is Acropora. Okay, so these ones, they are really easily identified by that enlarged terminal polyp. So what that means is the polyp that's right on the tip of the branch, okay, is usually a lot bigger than the rest, okay, and all the corallites are white, okay, so you'll see like white dots over the whole coral colony. You can often look inside the branches of these corals to find little juvenile or small reef fish, okay, and even little coral crabs and shrimp and that kind of thing as well. They like to hide in amongst the branches and the fingers of these corals, and they're quite fun to look for. Now, just a quick note, Acropora is one of our fastest growing species, okay? So these guys grow at about 10 centimeters per year, okay? So they're quite a dominant hard coral species on our reef. So they're quite common, and you've definitely seen them. They are all over. Cool. So our next one is Potilopora. This is kind of our knob horned coral or club horned coral. Okay, so you can see it looks quite similar to Acropora, but they don't have that enlarged terminal polyp. Okay, so all the polyps are the same size as each other. There's no ones that are bigger than the rest. Okay, they're all uniform in size, and these guys don't tend to form those kind of branching colonies like Acropora does. These ones are more those kind of knob-shaped projections. Turbinaria, so these are kind of like our plate-like corals, or they kind of look like vases sometimes, okay? Sometimes they do form these kind of swirly patterns or spiral-shaped patterns. They've got quite big polyps relative to other corals. And you find those polyps only on that top of that vase. Okay, so if you had to look at like the side or the underneath side of these colonies, okay, it's going to look quite smooth. Okay, so all the bumpy polyps are only on that kind of inside the vase, if that makes sense. The photo at the bottom here is a close-up of the polyps. So often you only see the polyps coming out at nighttime, actually. So this is one of our corals that generally feed at night with their tentacles. Okay, and so if you are lucky enough to see them out during the day, they kind of look like little tufts of hair kind of protruding from the little corallites. But yeah, otherwise it'll just be kind of a little bump. So this one is for Vites. So this is our honeycomb coral. So you can see it's got that really angular kind of honeycomb shaped polyps, okay? Now the really important characteristic here with these guys is that the polyps share the walls, okay? So for Vites, the polyps share the walls. So neighboring polyps won't have any ridges or valleys or anything in between the polyps, okay? It goes from one polyp into the wall straight into the other polyp, okay? Now compare that with our Favia. So Favia is our false honeycomb coral. You can see that these ones look very similar to the Vites, okay? And they are often confused, but I'm going to help you guys get better at distinguishing between the two in a second. So just having a look at these guys quickly, they do have more oval-shaped polyps, so it's not quite so angular or structured like the Vites. It's more kind of loose and, yeah, oval-shaped, okay? And the important one here is that they do not share the walls, okay? So you can see that those polyps, they've got like a little valley in between each neighbor, okay? So they do not share the walls. Here's a quick little, I guess, yeah, comparing the two here. So you've got Favietes on the left, and you'll see that Favietes shares the coral walls, okay? And then Favia, the corallites are alone, okay? So Favia, they are alone. So Platygyra is our next one. This one is quite obviously called brain coral. Okay, it's quite easy to see why it's called brain coral. Those striated ridges resemble a brain, okay? We've got a couple coral genera that actually look very similar to Platygyra, so it can be quite difficult to identify Platygyra compared with like the other ones. So if you just wanted to call these ones brain corals, you know, no one would, like that would be okay. So these guys can grow quite big. They can grow up to 1 meter or more in diameter. And you'll see that those corallites have actually fused to form these really long kind of meandering valleys. And they're quite beautiful. Our next one is fungia or mushroom corals. Okay, these ones are really cool. They're quite a unique coral, okay, in that they are a large single solitary polyp. So your mushroom corals do not form colonies, okay? They are solitary, free-living corals. So you'll see that central mouth groove on that picture there. It's that kind of lighter section in the middle, and then they've got those ridges that radiate out from that central mouth groove. Now these guys can be quite big. They can grow up to 15 centimeters in length. Again, just a reminder, this is a single solitary polyp, okay? So if you see one that is 15 centimeters in length, that's quite a big coral, and it's quite impressive to see. The cool thing about these guys is that because they are free living, they can actually use their tentacles to walk around the reef. So they'll crawl around until they find a place that they're happy, and then they'll just kind of sit there and do what they do. They can flip themselves upside down and right way up and that kind of thing. So they're quite resilient corals, versatile corals. The cool thing about these guys as well is that the babies actually grow on a little stalk. Okay, so you have your little your coral larvae that's floating around in the plankton. Once it is mature enough, it'll find a place on the reef to settle. It'll stick itself there and it'll grow a little stalk. Okay, then the baby mushroom coral will grow on that stalk. Once it reaches a certain size, it will detach itself and go and live its life as a wonderful free swimming adult coral polyp. And then another baby coral will grow on that stalk. So yeah, look out for the stalks. I have seen them around our reefs, particularly at like just before the arch or just after the arch by Four Boy. If you guys have been to Four Boy, there's that arch like on the left there. I have seen one of these little stalks there. So do keep an eye out for it next time you are diving. Our next one is Porites. So this is also called our porous coral. Okay, so they form really large colonies. Okay, so your Porites coral is one of your slowest growing corals. So these guys only grow about 1 to 2 millimeters a year. Okay, compare that with your Acropora that grows about 10 centimeters a year. Okay, so definitely a huge difference there. These guys, like I said, they grow up to 3 meters across. So if you do come across a really big Porites bommy, okay, you know it's really old, which is really cool. To identify these, it's pretty easy to identify them. They've got these really tiny little corallites that are really densely packed. And it forms kind of this mesh-like structure. You often get things like Christmas tree worms and little gobies and that kind of thing that have burrowed into the coral, or the gobies are kind of using old burrows as little hidey holes, and they're quite cool to see. Now, Galaxia is one of my absolute favorite species of coral. I hope you guys can see the video at the bottom there that's playing. But yeah, so Galaxia is very aptly named the galaxy or starburst coral. They are beautiful corals, okay? They've got these really distinct polyps with kind of this crown-like polyp structure. And then they've got that ring of little tentacles that sits around that crown. The really cool thing about Galaxia is that they are quite an aggressive competitor on reefs, okay? So this video is showing these really long sweeper tentacles that get extended at nighttime. And what they do with those sweeper tentacles is they just kind of reach around them and sting any neighboring coral colonies that are getting too close to them. And that is actually how they maintain their position on the reef. So this is a natural thing, okay? There's a lot of competition on reefs amongst coral and other solitary organisms, or sorry, sedentary organisms, okay? So this is a very natural process, but it is really cool. Our next one is Pachyceros. So Pachyceros is also known as our lettuce coral, okay? And it is most dominantly found on Lettuce Reef in Sodwana Bay. So these are some pictures I took at Lettuce Reef, and honestly, the photos don't do the reef justice. It really is a beautiful a beautiful spot to dive. These beautiful plate-like colonies, they've got these white edges, and it just makes for some really beautiful patterns and that kind of thing, like as you descend onto the reef. It is a deeper reef species, so they only like being in deeper waters, okay, or maybe kind of darker reef habitats. But yeah, it's a really impressive reef to visit. So if you haven't been to Lettuce yet, I do recommend it. It is definitely very, very beautiful. Tubastria. So this is another one of our really cool species in Sodwana. So this is also known as our green tree coral. Now, for those of you who have dived at Sodwana, you probably know this one quite well, okay? Our most famous example is found at 9 Mile Reef, named after the green tree, the massive, 1 meter high green tree coral colony that is sitting there. Okay, the cool thing about the green tree coral is it's actually called a black coral. Okay, so now you're probably telling me about that, but it's green or it's brown in color. I know that. The coral is called a black coral because it doesn't have any zooxanthellae. So this is one of our corals that does not have any of that symbiotic zooxanthellae in its tissues. So this means it gets all of its energy or all of its nutrition from plankton that it consumes. So it's got these really kind of fleshy sunflower looking tentacles that it sticks out, and it waves it about, catches the plankton, and then brings it in and yeah, digests it. So they're quite a cool coral. Now we actually have this coral all over 2 Mile, okay? They just don't grow very big anywhere else for some reason. So it's just the the 9 Mile Reef is just, it's a very impressive colony of this species, which is pretty cool. But yes, if you did really want to see them, you probably would find them elsewhere on 2 Mile Reef and around the place as well, but obviously just a lot smaller in size. So we've spoken about all our hard corals. We're now getting into our soft corals. Okay, so sarcophyton is one of our really common soft corals in Sodwana. This is called our mushroom soft coral. So they are kind of these circular colonies, and they've got this kind of convoluted fleshy head. They've also got what we call dimorphic polyps. So they have like a large stalked polyp that is surrounded by lots of little tiny, like smaller polyps dotting the surface. And yeah, they're quite common on our reefs. So you've probably seen these as well. Our next one is lobophyton. This is called our leather coral or lobed leather coral. Okay, they're generally encrusting colonies. I don't think I've seen them in any other kind of growth form. They mostly kind of stick to this kind of growth form, but they've got this kind of crumpled leathery appearance. Sometimes you get these kind of lobed projections and that kind of thing, but for the most part they stick nice and close to the reef surface. And yeah, the surface has fairly large polyps that are surrounded by tiny polyps that dot the surface. And yeah, they're all over the place as well. They're quite common. So we've got some other soft corals as well. Okay, so on the left here, you've got your thistle soft coral. Okay, these guys have little spicules embedded in the tissue that you can sometimes actually see. If you look really close, you can actually see those little spines or little spicules in the tissue, which is pretty cool. And then of course on our right-hand side here, we've got our whip coral. So whip corals are also a soft coral. You can often find little shrimp gobies little shrimps, whip coral shrimp and whip coral gobies kind of camouflaged on these corals. They're quite fun to try take photos of, very difficult, but some people have got it right. Cool, so we're going to do a bit of a quiz now. This is like a practice quiz for the real quiz. So basically just what we're going to do is I'm going to put a picture up just in your own, like on your own in your house, just kind of have a guess. And then I'll give you a little bit of time and then you can find out if you're right or not. So this one we can see it's got that central mouth groove. And if you guessed mushroom coral, you're right. Okay, so it is our fungia. Our next one here, you can see it kind of looks like a brain. So it is platygyra, or your brain coral. This one is my absolute favorite. So you can see those crown-like projections. You can see the ring of tentacles that sit around the crown. Okay, and if you guessed galaxia, you are correct. This is one of the ones that we like to get confused. Okay, so let's have a look. We've got kind of oval-shaped polyps with really thick walls. Okay, and we can see that the walls are not shared. Okay, so you can see there's that little valley in between each polyp and its neighbor. So if you guessed favia, you are correct. This one is a little bit different to the ones you would have seen on the presentation, but they've got the same characteristics. So if you have a look, you can probably see those enlarged terminal polyps, okay? So if you guessed Acropora, you are correct. This one is one of our soft corals, okay? So you can have a look, if you look really closely, you might see some of those embedded spicules in the tissue, okay? So if you guessed soft thistle coral, you're right, good job. And this is another one of our soft corals. So again, this one is a soft coral, and if you guessed whip coral, you got it. So this one, both of these are the same, okay? The one on the left is just showing you the polyps out or extended, and then the one on the right, the polyps are retracted, okay? So again, you can see that kind of convoluted head, and so if you guessed sarcophyton or soft mushroom coral, You're doing pretty well. Now this one, the polyps are really, really small, okay? So we can see that it's kind of forming that mesh-like structure over the surface of the colony. I mentioned earlier that you often get little Christmas tree worms and that kind of thing that burrow into these colonies, okay? And these colonies can grow quite large. So this one is Parietes. Our next one, again, this is a nicer picture of those enlarged terminal polyps, okay? And this is more of a branching kind of growth form for this coral. So if you guessed Acropora, you got it right. This one, you can see it's kind of our vase-shaped coral, or kind of, plate-like coral, okay? If you looked on the underside of this coral, you would see that the surface is smooth, okay? So there's no polyps on the underside. All the polyps are found kind of on that inside bit of that vase. So if you said Turbinaria, you are correct. This one is our really famous one in Sodwana. It's definitely a fan favorite in terms of dive sites that we have. So this is one of our black corals, okay? So remember, this coral does not have zooxanthellae, okay? It relies solely on its tentacles to capture plankton to sustain it. So if you guessed Tubastria or your green tree coral, we got it. Okay, this is our other one that we like to get confused with, but we can see that these ones, the walls are clearly shared, all right? There are no ridges or valleys in between the polyps, okay? So if you guessed Favites, you're right. So Favites is where they share the walls. So good job. This one, okay, this we know from our lettuce reef, okay? So lettuce reef is our really, the place where this one is. It is a deeper reef, okay? So we know that this is a deeper reef species. All right, so if you guessed Pachyceras or lettuce coral, you got it. This one looks a lot like our Acropora, but we see that there are no enlarged terminal polyps, okay? So it's more of a club shape that it forms, and all the polyps are the same size, okay? So if you guessed Posilopora, you got it. And our last one, this is one of our soft corals. You can see this particular one has kind of taken over the reef, as it tends to do a little bit, but that's all right. You can see it's kind of forming that kind of wrinkly leather appearance. So if you guessed Lobophytum, you are correct. Cool, so that's it from me. I'm just going to switch my presentation off. Yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed that. I can stick around for a little bit and answer some questions if any of you have any. Looks like there's a lot happening in the chat here. But yeah, if any of you have any particular questions that you'd like to ask, just feel free to type them up in the chat and I can answer a few. Otherwise, thanks for joining, everybody. Just a reminder that there is going to be a quiz as well, okay? The quiz is live, so you guys can go ahead and try that out if you want to. But yeah, otherwise, thanks so much for joining. Okay, we have a question here. Have you seen any bleaching in Sodwana? Sometimes we do get, I have noticed like one or two colonies that do seem a bit paler and that kind of thing, but definitely not on the large scale kind of problematic bleaching that is happening in Australia. So like we said earlier, our corals here are quite resilient. And I think we're quite lucky, like geographically where we are as well. Like we don't tend to kind of experience too much of it here. So we're quite lucky. Articles about Sodwana coral life. I don't know of any off the top of my head, but I can definitely have a look and I can post them over the next couple of days if I find any on our related materials section. Crown of thorns. Okay, so we had a similar question in our morning session as well about the crown of thorns. So we do get crown of thorns in Sodwana. I have seen them. There's one that tends to hang around on pinnacles, which he's kind of like, that one's always there. He's kind of hiding under that ledge near the fixed block on pinnacles. I don't think that they are a problem. Okay, like I said, I've only seen maybe 3 or 4 in like the whole of Sodwana in all my time diving there, so they're not in huge numbers. Okay, I will talk about crown of thorns in our invertebrates lecture as well, but just in case you don't I guess attend that one, I'll do a quick little spiel now about it. But the crown of thorns sea star is quite important on coral reefs. Okay, so they do have a role on the reef, and that is to actually keep coral like in check. So like I said earlier, remember our Acropora species, it's quite a fast growing coral. Okay, so if you had nothing predating on your fast growing corals, that species would actually dominate the entire reef. Okay, and reefs tend to do better when there's a lot of diversity in structure and species and that kind of thing. So your crown of thorns, when they are in the right numbers, so when their populations are in check, they do keep those faster growing corals kind of in check. So they don't let them dominate the reef as much. So they are super important. So the coral, when coral recovers from a bleaching event, where do the zooxanthellae come from to re-inhabit the polyps? So the zooxanthellae, this is something I'm not entirely sure, but I think like kind of the way I understand it is that the zooxanthellae, they live like they kind of float about in the water, but they're microscopic, so we can't see them. So they're part of the plankton. But I think they survive better when they are like in the coral host, I guess. I can try find some articles and I'll post those as well to kind of help myself explain that a bit better. Do all corals reproduce in the same season, or do they reproduce at different times of the year? It actually depends on the species, and it depends geographically as well. So like in Australia, okay, they have what is called a mass bleaching event. Okay, so pretty much like the entire reef mass spawning event, not bleaching, spawning, mass spawning event. So pretty much all the corals like spawn kind of like synchronized, like geographically in like its sections on the reef. I'm not so sure about Sodwana's reefs. I actually don't know. So I've been overseas for most of my diving and I guess education years. So I'm still learning the South African reefs again myself. But yeah, I'm not too sure. Growth speed for parietes. So I think they grow at about 1 to 2 mils a year, depending on the particular species. But the genus, I think, is about that average. So they're quite a slow growing coral. Yeah. So we have one here. Does the tentacles on Galaxia have any effect on fish or other sea life? Not that I know of. I haven't read any papers or anything like that in terms of them hurting fish or anything like that. They use their sweeper tentacles. So there's a lot of competition on reefs. So if you think of like fish competing for their space on the reef, they can, swim after each other and chase each other away and, you know, bite each other, that kind of thing. Corals can't do that, okay? So corals have to use their stinging cells to kind of maintain their position and protect their area, okay? So yeah, as far as I know, the corals only really use them on other corals or sponges or anemones or that kind of thing that are getting too close to them and kind of cramping their style. So yeah, I don't think that they purposefully attack fish and other things. Cool. Well, it sounds like the questions have kind of died off a bit. So let's see if I can find some other ones. Have you seen any of the mushroom corals detaching and walk? So they do walk quite slowly. So if I have, I probably haven't like noticed that they are walking. You know, they're quite a slow moving coral, okay? But I have seen the babies like on the stalk, and then you kind of see like a little group of individual mushroom corals all in the same area, and that's kind of a good indication that there is a stalk somewhere nearby. So I guess no, I haven't seen them walk, but yeah, we know they do kind of move themselves about. The stalk that I saw was probably about the size of my thumb, maybe. So maybe like a centimeter, 2 centimeters, or yeah, about 2 or 3 centimeters. Yeah, pretty cool. They tend to actually grow kind of like underneath other corals. Like the little stalk tends to be found like underneath other corals. So sometimes it's not very easy to find them. But yeah, if you know what you're looking for, then it is. So soft corals do not deposit calcium carbonate skeletons. Okay, so soft corals don't have a hard skeleton, but they've got little spines or what we call spicules, which can be made from calcium carbonate. And that gives them their structure. So they've got lots of those kind of embedded in the tissue. Is the coral on lettuce a single organism? So it is a colony, okay, and it's a very, very big colony, okay. So you've got like individual colonies that have kind of grouped together and that kind of thing, but yeah, it's huge. How are we limiting the damage from tourism? Is it possible to seed a coral reef? So that's getting into a really like a really interesting topic. I quite enjoy like the artificial reef and that kind of stuff. I'll definitely post some like articles and stuff about that. I won't chat too much about it now because it's like a kind of a whole nother thing, but definitely if you are interested, I will post some articles about that, no problem. Yes, there is lots of research going on in Australia with protecting corals, propagating corals, growing corals, all of that kind of thing. Yeah, if you guys are interested, I'll definitely post some cool articles that I find about that, no problem. Other than sea temperature rise, what other things can cause corals to bleach? Okay, so like I said, bleaching is a natural stress response. So corals need those particular conditions, okay? So they like the temperature to be a certain temperature, okay? If it's too hot or too cold, they bleach. They get stressed and they bleach. If the salinity is not right, so if the water is too salty or not salty enough, they get stressed and they can bleach. If the coral gets a bacterial infection or something like that, it gets stressed and it can bleach. So corals are quite like wussy, for lack of a better word, okay? They're quite sensitive animals, which is why it's so important that we really do our best to look after them. But yeah, whole range of things can make a coral bleach. So your first sign of bleaching is generally it goes pale, okay, and then it turns white. If you guys have Netflix, okay, Chasing Coral is an amazing documentary done that really explains the bleaching and documents the bleaching really, really well. When I first watched it, I cried. When I watch it even today, after like 100 times, I still cry. It's a beautiful movie. It's a very sad, real thing that's happening to the reefs around the world, but it really, like, it's a really, really well done documentary. So definitely, if you do have access to Netflix, please watch Chasing Coral. It is a very cool, very, very cool documentary. Which is my favorite reef? Oh my goodness, that's like asking someone to choose their favorite child. No, I have lots of favorites for lots of different reasons. Like I said, lettuce is very, very impressive. I love lettuce. More recently, like just before the lockdown happened, I was absolutely loving bikini, and stringer is always a favorite of mine. Yeah, we've got some really, really special sites at Sodwana, and I think we all miss it. I know I do a lot, but yeah, I know I'm not alone. Cool. Is Sodwana Bay protected? What coral families live in silt? Yeah, so that's a good question. I actually don't know off the top of my head. I can't give you any examples right off the top of my head, but I can have a look and see if I can find any information online. It is quite a it's more of an exposed area, and it depends kind of on the reef site that you visit as well. So thinking like your yeah, like your Anton's is quite sheltered, I guess, a little bit, because it's a bit more inshore, but then you've got like the upwellings and that kind of thing that happens. So it's very, very complicated. Yeah, that's right. So corals don't like silt, and they do actively try to remove silt. But I think there are some corals that are more tolerant of it. So it's not necessarily that they like living in it, it's just that they handle living there better than other species might. No problem. Okay, guys, well, it sounds like people are kind of wrapping up. Hope everyone has a lovely evening. Looking forward to chatting more tomorrow. Yeah, like I said, the quizzes are up now, so feel free to go and have a go at those. Yeah, thank you for everyone who joined today. Really appreciate you guys. Yeah, see you guys.